Chapter 5. Roses and Revelations. Emma's alarm sounded at 8:30 the next morning. Shutting it off and trying to ignore it for several minutes, she was shocked to full consciousness upon realizing she was alone in her own bed. Had she dreamt Johnny being there? A strange panic in her chest was quickly subsided, realizing the other side of the bed was too neatly made for her to have done it herself. The other pillow was fluffed in a way she was unfamiliar, and examining that side, smelled the familiar pine scent she associated with Johnny. So he had been there, she thought. The panic resumed, accompanied by a wave of shame. What had she done? It was so unlike herself to instigate something like that. So intimate, even if it was with someone as platonic as Johnny. And what if someone had seen? What if Margot had seen, or Jordan, who would obviously relay that to her? She didn't think Johnny would ever tell someone, but what if his guilt became worse than hers, and he had to get it off his chest? What then? Emma stared at herself in the mirror, her eyes bagless and clear. Only then did she realize something that made the entire situation that much more confusing. That was the best sleep she'd had in ages. Another wave of panic followed, realizing why she was awake at this time. That was why she had left, after all. She had lied to Johnny the previous night. She hadn't gone east to Rapid City, but south, all the way to Denver, locking herself in a hotel room for Saturday's entirety and trying her best not to focus on today's stress test. What if she failed? Had been her constant worry since Friday afternoon. What if I miss and someone sees? She and her father had painstakingly trained for years. Target after target, weight after weight, shape after shape. Target practice was second nature now. She could do it in her sleep, and yet there was always that purveying worry that some unforeseen variable, whether real or imagined, would affect any random throw, and someone might finally notice. At least it wouldn't be Johnny, she thought. If the previous night had proven anything, it was his complete naivety. He had completely bought her story about cleaning the dishes. Of course, she hadn't been doing dishes. There had been no chance to hide the evidence of her broken glass before he came rushing out of his bedroom ready to strangle her, and if anyone else had come out but Johnny, it would have been obvious to them that she'd been drinking. Even that had failed to calm her nerves, and in truth the whole broken glass situation had amplified them that much further. If her father found out she had snuck alcohol into their common room, she would never have privacy again. There was a fine balance between feeling safe in the squad thanks to her father and coincidentally feeling watched around the clock. If Johnny were to spill things to her parents, as he most certainly could, it would be the complete end of her autonomy. Nervous shame continued to wrap her as she dressed for the day. It was cold and cloudy, uncharacteristic for early September, and she dug a pair of black leggings out from the bottom of her drawer to combat. Knowing they would be changing as soon as they reached the training center, she added over a gray t-shirt a white sweatshirt with the large navy seal of rice. What was Johnny thinking? She thought, exiting her bedroom and finding only Liz in the kitchen, eating a brand of cereal Emma had never seen before. His absence from her bed surprised her the more she thought about it. He was a far heavier sleeper than she was, so how had he woken up before her and left without her knowing? The thought pounded around inside her head. She had driven all the way to Colorado without a license. She had smuggled alcohol into their common room. She had completely abandoned all responsibility and ignored her friends for an entire weekend. And yet, all she felt sorry for, even in the slightest, was that she had spent the night in the same bed as a boy. A boy she knew. A boy she trusted. And most importantly, a boy she felt no desire towards whatsoever. Why did she feel guilty? Who was she supposed to apologize to? Herself? God? There wasn't an outright answer to it. It wasn't something she should have felt so upset about, but she did. And who could she talk to about it? Obviously not Margot or Jordan. They already expected the two to suddenly fall in love or something. This would probably prove their suspicions. Emma could never try to deny their accusations if they knew what happened. Her parents? That'd be too embarrassing. As far as they were concerned, she was the last innocent child they had left, and destroying that image would probably push them into favoring Andrew even more than they already did. She couldn't talk to Andrew about it. He'd never had a platonic relationship in his life. He'd probably see this as a stepping stone into some political side strategy. Sleeping around for favors when name alone wouldn't do the trick. The thought of that made Emma sick. Sure, there had been offers. Never outright, but some of her father's lower aides had made subtle passes over the summer, probably thinking they could weasel something out of her for their own political gain. All this had done was prove which members of the embassy were creeps, and whom she should avoid, but Andrew had been taking advantage of similar offers for years, practically in an on-and-off relationship with Pema Tanner, the Deputy Undersecretary of Internal Law and Justice, who, despite being over 10 years his senior, had helped him out of a number of potential legal problems, which also could have marred their father's image. Of course, their parents would never know. Even if they did, Andrew was never punished, which was part of the reason she felt she couldn't trust him. He had no concept of consequence. That left Riley. Sure, he might criticize her decision to do what she did, but he was as real with her as anyone ever was and would ease her mind about everything tangled inside it. But he had been somewhat short with her the last several days, and she struggled to find anything to say to him. After 5 minutes of struggling to formulate anything over text, she simply wrote, "Stress test today. Wish me luck. before committing to the kitchen and making herself a peanut butter bagel. You good? Liz barked with a mouthful of cereal after Emma downed both bagels in quick succession. What? Emma sidestepped. She'd blanked out of thinking about Johnny again. You look worried, Liz said. I didn't sleep last night, she lied. Cheers to that, Liz returned. We'll be fine, though. I hope so, Emma thought, but found herself unable to say. At that moment, Margot had emerged, matching her in every aspect of her outfit except the sweatshirt's text. Hers was plastered with the long, faded face of an unrecognizable musician. Morning, she grinned carelessly, as though oblivious to the day they were all about to suffer. She swept around the aisle into Emma's other side, where for the first time she noticed a glass vase filled to the brim with pink roses. Seeing the other two looking at her curiously, she explained, Jordan got me flowers. 1 week anniversary. Emma could sense Liz rolling her eyes along with her. Hell of a week, she teased. Longest week of my life, Margot retorted, though unable to hold her grin in for long. She reached a pair of fingers amongst the flowers and pulled off a petal that would have soon fallen on its own. Realizing the others were still watching, she blushed, put the petal in her mouth, and swallowed it whole before choking back a chuckle. Kent hobbled down the stairs next, his hair untidy as if he couldn't be bothered to try combing it straight out of bed. Soon after came Jordan, and lastly Johnny, with a broad glance toward Emma amidst the others that completely masked any awkwardness between them. You could always just talk to him about it, a voice said inside her head, and she once again felt a shower of guilt drip down her shoulders. She turned away from Johnny, blushing, and hurried for something to keep her attention occupied. Liz had finished her bowl of cereal, and Emma was quick to add it to her stack of dishes. Toning out the others' conversations and doing her best to distract herself in the sink, she was snapped out of her working trance when Margot began to help Kent put his shoes on, and with 20 minutes until their call time, the squad exited the residential center and made their way to the dome. The wind was whistling across the flat plain between the buildings. In spite of the weather, dozens of other kids were scattered around the circle, a handful tossing a football, others just clumped in different groups, hanging on irritably to windswept pages of homework. It was bizarre that other people were just going about their day as normal, as though nothing else was happening. People just went on with their lives without a care in the world, while Emma and the rest of the squad marched anxiously toward a day full of mental exhaustion. A few contemporaries even waved and said hello as they passed. Margot looked like she wanted to stop and talk as long as she could, but realized smartly that her mind was already focused on the task ahead. In fact, nothing really felt different to a normal weekend until they finally walked through the doors of the training center. The bustling noise of squads moving throughout the many corridors was absent, replaced by an eerie mechanical hum which emanated from the training floor itself. Emma could hear every pipe and duct rattling with haunting reverberations, and in finally making it through the uncanny corridor to their dressing area, realized they must be the only squad in the entire building. Inside the meeting room, Xander sat behind the front desk, immersed in his tablet, already dressed in his mission suit beneath a white sweatshirt and jeans, a look which didn't seem to fit him in the slightest. Hardly glancing up, he spoke pure instructions. Street clothes over suits, he began. Grab a weapon or two and pack a bag. It could be your only companion all day. The six stared around at each other. Kent looked desperate for more instruction on account of his leg. You have exactly 5 minutes. Go! The stress on this final word told Emma there was an urgency in the time given. She thought immediately of Riley and desperately wished he were here with them. He was good at keeping time in his head. She tried counting silently as long as she could, but concluded rather quickly that there would be little chance of doing the task in time if her focus wasn't entirely there. In the center of their dressing area, 2 separate piles on the floor gave the room an essence of a crime scene. One pile was scattered with dozens of black firearms and ammunition, the other energy bars, meal packs, and various medical supplies. In each of their locker bays, new sets of clothes hung around their usual seats, atop which sat a matching black backpack open in every compartment. Immediately, Emma, Johnny, and Liz rushed to the floor, grabbing anything they might find helpful during the exercise. Jordan and Margot both started to dress, as did Kent, who started to sweat when he was unable to properly fit the suit over his cast. As soon as he was dressed, Jordan pulled a medical scissors from the pile on the floor and cut off the bottom pant leg of Kent's suit, much to the latter's objection. Finally being convinced it was the only way it would fit, Kent conceded, allowing Jordan and Margot to help him with the rest of his tasks. Johnny yelled abruptly at Liz, who jumped in surprise after he stopped her from stuffing all the remaining medical supplies into her own bag. His reasoning, rather justifiably, was that there was a strong chance any one of them could be separated from the main group, in which case losing the entirety of any supply would dock them serious points. Instead of arguing, Liz simply dropped her bag, told Johnny to finish for her, and switched her attention to getting changed. Once Emma was satisfied with her own haul, a large roll of gauze, a thermal blanket, and a package of bandages, she joined Liz in stripping as fast as possible, worrying that their time was coming to a swift end. As Margot and Jordan were concluding their own hauls, Emma pocketed a single pistol and strapped it to her belt alongside 2 magazines, while also managing to scalp a set of matching carving knives, which were all heavier than her preference, but nothing she found uncomfortable. Finally satisfied with her preparation, Emma turned to exit back to the classroom. Without warning, the door was quite literally broken down in front of her. Kicked in at the handle, it swung with such speed around its hinges that it hit the wall behind and shattered into 100 pieces before Kent, who stood cautiously frozen in front of the pile of guns. Behind it, 5 men and a very large woman, all heavily armed, burst through the threshold and held every one of the squad at gunpoint. "On the ground!" the leader yelled deafeningly, grabbing Emma by the ponytail and shoving her to the floor, where she collapsed inches away from her dropped knives. Johnny, Jordan, Liz, and Margot all dropped to their knees, their hands in the air. The woman kicked Kent's crutches aside and forced him painfully onto his own hands and knees. Out of the corner of her eye, Emma saw Johnny crawl his outstretched fingers toward a loaded pistol on the floor, but apparently so did his guard, as he growled, "Don't even try it," before whipping him hard in the cheek with the butt of his rifle. All 6 were frozen in fear, none more so than Margot and Liz, both of whom seemed utterly shell-shocked by the intrusion. Emma was able to find her sense after a few seconds of thought, knowing this all must be part of the exercise, but upon recognizing the magazines in the soldiers' rifles as legitimate compared to their own brightly marked training rounds, became more worried about an accidental misfire. "Get up!" the leader spoke assertively. The 6 of them managed a quick glance at one another before following the directions. One by one, they were shuffled back into the classroom, where Xander sat still at his tablet as though the escorting of the squad at threat of gunpoint was an everyday occurrence. The squad were forcefully sat around the center. Then the rest disappeared back into the dressing area, returning far more peacefully to return their packed equipment, and then disappearing out the hallway door. Xander gave them a look of mirthful incompetence. "I told you, 5 minutes," he grinned. Emma huffed. The boys seemed to take the joke in stride too, shaking off the stress from their shoulders, Johnny massaging his now bruised jaw. Margot and Liz remained static. "All right," Xander reconvened without hesitation. "Down to business. Our mission today looks like this." A holographic model of a house flashed in the center of the room. "This is the retreat home of Valtteri Lehkonen, the Finnish Minister of Foreign Affairs. For the last 5 years, he's been accepting bribes from the Kremlin to block Swedish claims on drilling rights in the Bay of Bothnia, until a few months ago, when a joint Scandinavian consortium privately outbid the Russians and threatened to expose his corruption in Union courts, if he retracts their current agreement. As you would expect, the Russians were a bit pissed he's not answering their emails, so they intend to replace him with his more flexible junior minister, Pekka Suominen, who they've already committed to their payroll. To get Lehkonen out of the way, they've shipped a short-range explosive device in amongst a goodwill package coming from Lisbon on behalf of the Portuguese. It's crudely made, but specific enough to bypass any security sensors between Lisbon and Jaltseno. The schematic rotated to display the interior of the house. Our job is to intercept and dispose of the package before it detonates near enough any individuals who might recognize the threat. That means we have to go completely undetected. Again, the visual rotated, this time zooming out to show a map of the larger area. Emma shifted her attention to the screen at her desk, working her way through the house to locate its numerous exits. Now, the house is minimally guarded. However, the house's location near the Russian border makes it the perfect place to host foreign relations parties. About double the normal security will be on site because of the presence of Gabriel Reznikov, a private petroleum executive coming from St. Petersburg. The Russian Foreign Department are under the impression that if the attack happens with Russian citizens in proximity, it'll take the blame completely away from Moscow, and maybe even implicate the consortium. We're anticipating about 30 armed security in and around the complex, with an internal population between 30 and 40 unarmed civilians and diplomats. You must go completely undetected by anyone outside the house's basement receiving center, and anyone who sees you there must be taken out with one of these. He held up a small vial about half the size of a pencil. It works like an EpiPen, he explained, demonstrating the retractable needle at the flat end. Shot of this anywhere below the neck will knock them out instantly and reverse their memory for about 10 minutes prior to the shot. Jordan raised his hand. How long are they out for? About half an hour, Xander replied. Kent's hand went up next. What happens if we stab them above the neck? You might kill them, he replied nonchalantly. Too many nerve endings and blood vessels that close to the brain. You might fry something. Best to stay under the ears if you don't want a body count. Emma found her own arm lifting. So, no kills? Unless absolutely necessary, Xander courted. Extreme self-defense or escape only. Any bodies could leave a serious international crisis on our hands. What about the unconscious ones? Johnny added. Leave them, Xander demanded. We'd rather let them argue into an economic stalemate than risk believing an external assassin was sent to disrupt proceedings. The visual once again zoomed through the house, and Xander walked them through the plan. Kent was to be calling the shots, but removed from the property on account of his leg. Emma and Liz were to stay back from the house on opposite ends of the tree line, keeping the group alert to the comings and goings of any unaccounted personnel. That left Jordan, Margot, and Johnny to infiltrate the actual building, with Jordan tasked with reading the building and keeping an overview of the facility and the people inside, while Johnny and Margot made their way to the mailroom to find the package. The second half of the plan was a bit simpler. Since the package was to be detonated away from any people, they had to drive 10 minutes to the southwest and dispose of the package in the forest before claiming the mission a success. And remember, Xander concluded, It may just be an exercise, but I want you to treat it like a real mission. The explosive isn't a decoy. It's an actual live bomb, so be careful. Just because you know we're at the training center doesn't mean there aren't serious things that could go wrong." With these words, Margot and Liz continued to look completely bewildered. Even the boys seemed caught off guard. Kent, on the other hand, seemed to register his relative's safety within the confines of the control room. When the plan had been recited a few more times, Xander instructed them to gather their things and led the way out the hall, where, parked just ahead on the lip of the training floor, was an unmarked white delivery van, one of the missions vehicles Emma had heard her brothers discuss so many times. Ripping open the rear doors, Emma's first thought of the van's interior was that of a miniature cargo plane. While the front and passenger seats were the standard you might find in any vehicle, save for the lack of a middle console, the rear floor was bare, with 2 padded benches adorning either wall, above and below which sat netted storage cubbies, currently bare of any additional materials. It felt a bit like a smaller version of their dressing room. Inviting Kent to the front seat, Xander instructed the rest of them to find a seat in the back and buckle themselves in, before turning on the van and driving them beyond the outskirts of the caverner's floor space. Almost as soon as they started moving, the front windshield was obscured by a brief blackout, before returning to an obviously simulated view of a winding road. Xander, too, seemed taken aback, as he stopped driving to register his surroundings, then continued at the wheel and pedals, now driving through the simulation. Emma and Johnny were cramped next to Liz on the driver's side wall, with Jordan and Margot on the opposite, cuddled closer than necessary and interlocked in a side embrace. Thankfully for their observers, the simulated drive to the compound was no more than 5 minutes, with the vehicle coming to a halt about half a kilometer away from the light of the house. One more time, Xander led them through the plan, able to show them a brief overview of the complex through a screen built into the windshield. Having taken only a pistol for the sake of weight, Emma traded for Johnny's rifle, though kept her knives at her hip while leaving her bag alongside the others in the van. Choosing to forego the bulbous helmets which might be beneficial in less stealthy missions, their last task before exiting was to fit and test their earpieces. As quietly as possible, the 5 in the vehicle's rear opened the doors and hopped out on the simulated grass. A wave of cold rushed through every layer of Emma's clothes. "Holy hell!" she constricted, able to see every breath despite the only light coming from within the van. The others seemed just as taken aback. In the 5 minutes they'd been inside the van, the temperature on the floor had dropped to below freezing. "Welcome to Finland," Xander joked, to the absent response of everyone else. "Grab hats and gloves." With the slight sound of moving over the van's metal floor and zipping open bags, they each found a black set of covers for their extremities, before resuming their respective tasks. Coming from the empty black ceiling high above, accurately simulating a winter sky, snow began to fall. "Kent, you're calling the shots," Xander's voice whispered in her ear. Kent started on the other side. All right." Emma loaded her rifle. Huddle up. 212, he continued. "Girls, escort the other 3 to the house. Stay clear of the main path." "Give them a route," Xander coached through the headpiece. "Oh," Kent stammered again, clearly figuring it out from within the van. 30 meters to the right of the drive," he continued. "Stay within the first line of trees." The 5 did as they were told. Emma and Johnny in front, Liz and Margot in the rear. Snow continued to fall heavy in their faces, but the house was the only source of light, gleaming from the end of their path. 2 of them, Jordan whispered into his comm. 40 meters to the right." Xander and Kent took a moment to respond. "Confirmed," came Xander's voice. "Don't engage unless they do first. Stay en route." Liz and Emma kept their eyes peeled to the right, but they were quickly approaching the house. "I don't think they see us," Jordan relayed. Emma continued to look through the tree line, but could see nothing. A fake wind was howling from that direction instead. She could feel her jaw chattering. The tree line took a dramatic veer to the right as they approached the compound. There was no fence, but instead a large assortment of various black vehicles that blocked any clear path into the building. To the right of the main entrance, an ice-covered staircase tucked its way down to the hill to the lower level. "We're here," Johnny whispered. "What now?" "Tell them how to separate," Xander instructed. "Emma and Liz, backtrack 50 meters. Liz crossed the path and covered the northeastern side of the woods." They did as they were told, rifles to their shoulders as they abandoned the other 3, and listened to Kent continue instructions. Emma could still see nothing. Jordan had mentioned in previous training sessions how poor his vision was on the shifting floor, but he had sounded so certain when they approached. She had long thought his ability was interesting, but for the first time, alone and freezing in the dark woods, did she seriously envy it. She continued to step solitarily through the woods. "Jordan, are you sure there were 2 to the west?" she whispered into her ear. "Don't answer," Xander interrupted on Jordan's behalf. "Emma, he's inside. He can't talk. Just keep your eyes peeled for movement and stay hidden." She did as she was told, but her heart was now racing. What if they'd seen her? She felt foolish for not considering them in the exact position as her. A rustling of branches some 20 meters to her left forced her to jump. There's no way they have scouts in the trees, she thought. With no light, she turned behind a trunk and lifted her rifle, finding only a large squirrel hopping between the snow-covered branches. Her heart continued to pound. "Emma, make your way back to the building." Kent's voice drilled her back into focus. "Liz, stay put. There's a guard approaching your 5. Instinctively, Emma turned and looked across the path. With no clue where Liz was hidden on the other side, she also failed to see any guards moving in the open. "Maybe they've seen you too," she thought, and started moving back toward the house. Rifle back at her shoulder, her pace began to increase, and with it her gait became sloppier, but she could not control the increase in both her heart rate and her shivering, and found herself longing for the ability to control the temperature. 15 meters from the wall of cars, she spotted Johnny, Jordan, and Margot sliding through the lower door and climbing the side stairs. "I'm right in front of you," she whispered into the comms. Jordan spotted her first, as she had expected. The trio joined her in stride as they worked their way back toward the van. Halfway back down the drive, Jordan slowed to a halt. "Hold on," he said pensively. "Johnny, let me see that." Johnny had been the one carrying the small envelope-sized box. His head swiveled to check the trees. He handed it over. "Do not open it," Xander echoed through their ears. Suddenly Jordan froze, his confused eyebrows pinched. "Xander, it's not a bomb," he whispered. A line of silence permeated through the comms. After a few seconds, Xander returned. "What do you mean it's not a bomb?" Jordan started to feel his way around the edges of the box, looking to unpack it. "Are you sure this is the right package?" Xander's voice began to rise. "It has to be," Jordan frustrated, sliding his finger under the tape and pulling hard on the flap. "It's the only one that fit the description," Margot seconded. "I can't feel it," Jordan argued. "I'd be able to feel it if it was a—" His hand wrenched open the box, and he immediately dropped it. In the darkness, Emma couldn't see what was spilling out onto the ground, but Jordan covered his nose and mouth with his shirt. "Anthrax?" Emma started, but her contemplation was halted by a loud ringing in her ears. All 4 of them ripped out their earpieces, the line screaming its demise, as just then a massive explosion came from down the path. Where the van had been parked, an enormous golden fireball burst into the sky, illuminating everything around them. The 3 of them shocked into silence. Emma knew with every sense of logic she had left, Xander and Kent couldn't possibly be dead in this training exercise, but the sight of the vehicle obliterated by flame atop her already heightened senses threw all logic aside, and Emma focused everything in her power to not run for her life. Their momentary fixation was interrupted by shouting from within the trees. "Go!" Johnny shouted, shoving Emma into the trees and toward the hidden voices. Gunfire erupted all around them as they had been spotted, and the 4 darted in and out of the forested maze to avoid it. 20 meters in, Johnny physically ran into one of the guards, and with zero hesitation, blew the man's head off with his sidearm. Emma stood frozen to the spot. "Give me your rifle!" Johnny urged, swapping his handgun with hers. She couldn't even find words to respond. "We have to scatter," he continued. "Find your way to the edge of the floor and stay there. It's got to be the safest place." Jordan and Margot agreed, both bolting in separate directions, but Emma was still frozen in shock, continuing to forget this was all just an exercise. "Emma, you'll be all right," he whispered. But as she continued to stand frozen, he gripped her by the collar and spun her around, shoving her forward and forcing her onward. "Run!" She sprinted as fast as she possibly could, doing her best to avoid tree roots and uneven ground. Every few seconds, gunfire seemed to whistle past her head, but still she kept running. Just keep going, she thought over and over again, knowing that wherever she was on the floor, eventually she would reach the edge. Then she literally hit a wall. Crumpling to the ground, the wind knocked completely from her system. Emma looked up at a great barrier of blackness stretching as far as her limited vision could see. She did not dare shine a light on it for fear she was still being followed, until she realized the sound around her had changed. She was no longer in the forest, or at least not out in the open. She clicked her tongue a few times and realized the ceiling above her was no longer the ceiling of the training floor. She was in a more confined space, and daring to try the flashlight from her belt, discovered that she had run 10 meters directly into the mouth of a cave. Where she had hit the wall, the cave veered off sharply to the right, where she could hear the dripping of running water. The temperature, too, had increased, and when she noticed the sweat dripping down her forehead, stripped herself of any warm layers and swore loudly when she realized her backpack was gone. Only then, naked in her black skin suit, did she allow herself to breathe. It took everything within her not to break down as her heightened state lowered. The image of Johnny's blank face was plastered permanently to the inside of her eyelids, emotionless and swift as he blew the artificial face apart. Would he really do that? She thought, struggling to separate the concepts of practice and reality, before realizing that was the whole point. They want us to break. Jackets, pants, gloves, and hat at her feet, the cave now sweltering and misty. She blinked hard and crumpled pensively to the base of the cave wall. How had Andrew done? She wondered, trying to imagine her brother in a similar situation. She was sure each exercise was tailored to each squad's strengths and weaknesses, and instead began to think about the creativity in building each of the simulated exercise. Then her mind shifted to Riley. What had his first mission been like? He'd been in Scotland at that time. What was their training center like? Was it as large and modern as the one in Tylersville? Surely it had to be, but she struggled to imagine a large white dome plastered against the side of a massive castle. The thoughts of Riley calmed her, but no sooner had she relaxed when a familiar voice bounced through her head. "Em?" it called. It took a moment to register her own name. For a moment she wondered whether it was just the sound of the cave water, but the voice spoke again. "Emma?" It was coming from the cave's entrance, the way she had come, and the voice was unmistakably Riley's. "That's not possible," her best senses shouted, but still her voice responded. "Riley?" She flashed her light upon the curve to the cave, where the shaggy figure of her second brother threw up his hand upon the exposure to the blinding beam. "Whoa!" he blinked. "Chill out there." Emma could feel her jaw on the cave floor, but nothing between her brain and body could pull it back up. "I'm glad I found you," Riley said. His caramel hair was even wavier than usual, as if he had just been dragged out of bed. His eyes looked tired, his shirt and pants slightly baggier than should fit a boy of his size. Emma could not be more convinced it was him. She felt the light drop from her hand as she rushed to hug him. Tears flooded down her cheeks. He'd grown taller and stronger in the years since she had last seen him, but he still felt the same. He still smelled the same. "Why are you here?" she shouted. "How are you here?" Before he could take a breath to answer, she added, "Does Mom know you're here? Does Dad know you're here?" His smile, his usually sly grin, his eyes scrunching to their thinnest Hawaiian shape, he responded, "Of course Dad knows I'm here. Nothing happens in this town without the boss knowing. You should know that." For a split second, Emma remembered the previous night and had the terrifying image of her father watching her cuddled beside Johnny in her own bed. Riley's next words snapped her back. "Mom doesn't." "But," she stuttered. "Why?" "They flew me in for your stress test," he claimed. "They brought Andrew in for mine." "But why?" Something family connection," he lied. "I'm just kidding. I have no idea. They just do." "Well, who'd they bring in for Andrew?" Riley shrugged. "I don't know. He never told me. Uncle Mark, maybe?" They hadn't seen their father's younger brother in years. "Well, what are we supposed to do together?" she wondered aloud. "Fight our way through the cave," Riley claimed. Emma peeled her eyes. "You had a cave too?" Riley nodded. "Everyone has a cave." Emma tried to imagine Johnny and Jordan in their own caves at the other end of the training floor. Who would they have brought in? She turned back to Riley. "What's at the end of it?" "I'm not allowed to tell you," he claimed. "There's nothing there, is there?" Her brother was a bad liar, but his poker face stood firm. "I can't tell you." Emma clenched her jaw. "All right, but you're here to help me, aren't you?" His face broke into a smile. "Of course I am." "Then where's your gun?" He was dressed in his usual casual clothes. His pockets were obviously empty. "You have it," he nodded. "What? I'm taking yours," he claimed. "That's part of the mission." "Riley," she sighed, but he was adamant. He held out his hand with a continued smirk. "Them's the rules, sis." "Riley, I... She hesitated to hand over the pistol. Her voice was small. "I'll be defenseless." "Use your effect," he urged, grabbing hold of the gun. "I can't use my effect," she scolded. "Should have brought your knives then," he cocked, measuring the pistol in his hand. Emma froze. "What do you mean I should have brought my knives?" Riley began to move onward through the cave. "Your effect," he explained nonchalantly. "If it requires a tool, you should always have one on you." She pulled one of the knives she'd taken from the dressing room out of her belt. Riley turned. "Oh," he noticed. "Never mind. Why would you—" She started, stopping herself mid-sentence. Riley knew, she thought. Riley would still know. "Why would I what?" The figure in front of her continued with her brother's voice. Her brother's finger was tucked casually around the trigger of the pistol. Emma's heart was accelerating. "Nothing," she squeaked. "Sorry, I lost my train of thought." "Get out," her brain screamed. The figure was still gripping the pistol, but his eyes remained unsuspicious, and his posture remained relaxed. Stay calm, she thought. Come on, she gestured, urging the form of her brother forward to go ahead of her again. Lead the way. All right, it re-embarked, turning to face the blackness ahead. Give me some light, will you? Emma breathed low and deep, focusing everything in her power not to allow her shaking hands to distract the beam of light. Next chance, she thought. So, she hummed, did you reach out to Dad for this, or did he reach out to you? The figure kept moving. I'm sorry? Riley's voice bounced around the walls. Did Dad recruit you for this? She asked again. How'd that conversation go? Oh, it said. Fine, I guess. We didn't really talk much. And you haven't talked to Mom at all. Emma, I told you I haven't really... The cave veered left. As soon as the figure moved ahead with it, Emma spun on her heel and bolted back the way she'd come. It had noticed. It shouted at her to come back, first with Riley's voice, then what sounded like Andrew's. She could hear it chasing behind her, and knew she would never beat it out of the cave. But there was the entrance. A light spilled from the outer floor through the wall to the left. The thing's breath was at her neck. Emma's heart was so fast its beating had disappeared. Almost there, she begged. And then it touched her. And with a visceral reaction, she spun fast once more, bringing with her fist the lit flashlight and all the momentum she could muster. The bulb shattered, and darkness once again plunged the last length of the tunnel. The figure fell, and with it the gun skidded across the floor of the cave, where it was illuminated by the cave door. Emma launched herself onto it, grasped it with both hands, and fired every remaining shot into the face that was recovering atop her, the bloodied face of her mother. The thing fell with a thud. It remained her mother, though the small sounds it attempted to make could have come from any one of her family, and the face was now utterly unrecognizable. It could have been seconds that she stood in the doorway. It could have been minutes. Time came second to processing everything that had happened so far, when it suddenly took on a completely new importance. What time is it? She wondered. And how much more of this do I have to endure? Riley would know. She laughed, wishing once again that he was, really and truly, here with her now. Emma shook herself back to urgency. The gun was out of ammo, but she picked it up in case she needed a device more threatening than the knives on her hip. Exiting the cave, she found not only the temperature the extreme opposite as when she had entered, but the grass and trees were gone, replaced by a dry stone floor and a maze of Mayan ruins, refocusing her to the center of the building. The entire outer edge was a sheer wall of black obsidian. The cave entrance had shut and sealed behind her. They're trying to herd me back to the middle, she thought. I need to find the others. No sooner had she thought this than an ear-piercing scream came from close by. The empty gun in hand, Emma hugged the ruined walls with her right shoulder and slowly worked her way to the noise. A cardinal set of open gates led off from a central courtyard, a dry fountain in the middle. Tucked around to the nearest gate, Emma heard another scream beyond the wall, followed by a series of moaning and grunting coming from a voice unmistakably female. Her first thought being of Margot, she kept her hands tight around the pistol and dared with held breath to peer around the gate's edge. A great black bonfire stood unlit at the center of a bare orange grove. Without flames, the wood of the fire was still recently charred, but to Emma's horror, she realized the pile was not firewood at all, but burned human remains. This shock was nothing compared to the sight between her and the tower. 5 meters from the body stood Liz, hunched over maniacally with a 2-foot-long machete in her left hand, its blade and her entire front painted red from sprays of blood. At her feet, 4 unburned men were as black as their charred counterparts, though their ebony skin too was drenched in blood, for them their own. Though they were certainly dead after the blows from Liz's hand, she continued to hack them to pieces methodically, one body after another as though she were striking an instrument. The sounds issuing from her nose and mouth told Emma that Liz was finding nothing but ecstasy in the act, but she realized with another jolt that Liz was sobbing, wailing in fact, before releasing another scream of unidentifiable emotion that chilled Emma frozen. Then Liz spotted her. All intent of reuniting with her squad fled Emma's body as Liz, red in the face, snot-nosed and bloodshot, froze with equal horror at being discovered. Run! Emma bolted to the next gate, beyond which stood another maze, this one carved from thickly planted birch trees and undergrowth. Forced to split at another wall, she jolted left, then right, then left again, before tripping over a large exposed tree root and scraping her knee just shy of a river bend, which flowed fast in front of her, separating her from the continuing path by a width of 10 meters. The water was dark and black, appearing bottomless. She turned back to the maze exit, ditching the dead gun for a single knife, and praying she would not falter her next shot. Noise scurried through the forest all around her, but neither Liz nor any other thing, living or otherwise, came from where she had. Instead, the undergrowth off to her right snapped and rustled. Something was trying to climb its way through the brush, but the trees and plants remained so thick she couldn't see past its outer layer. Her heart palpitating as high as ever behind her chest, she refocused her aim between the 2 large white trees and waited with bated breath for the thing to emerge. It was Jordan, who tripped on the outer edge just as she had done before holding up his hands and surrendered to his armed companion. "Hold up!" he begged. "It's me!" "Prove it!" Emma demanded, her knife still steadied against her thumb, unwavering. "How the hell do I prove it?" he parried, shaking worse than she was. I don't know, she argued, Say something only Jordan would know. He took a deep breath and spoke. Though Emma spoke little French, she knew exactly what he had replied. I want to get the hell out of here. Emma was calmed, but still not off her guard. She wanted more than anything to trust Jordan, but she could not get fooled again. They would know that, she optioned. They would know you speak French. Say something only Jordan Delarue would say to me. They'd been friends for years. She, Margot, Johnny, and Jordan had done everything together. Skiing in the mountains, weekend sleepovers at the mansion, even church youth group. Surely there was something he could say or do that would prove to her without a shadow of a doubt that this was him. She certainly didn't expect him to drop his pants to the ground. She let her knife drop as low as her jaw. It took her a second to realize what she was looking at before moving her eyes back up to his face. Though he had little reason to have a smug look on his face, she half expected to find one, but his eyes were only filled with desperation to be trusted. Why would you— So you know it's me! He shouted. Emma could not argue. She put her knife back in her belt. Whoa, 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 he paused, his pants still around his ankles. How do I know you're really you? She huffed a laugh through her nostrils. I'm not pulling my pants— Fucking hell, Emma, he frowned. I don't need to see you naked to know it's you. Just complain about something like you usually do. She hesitated blankly. When we get out of this, I'm going to kill my dad the next time I see him. Jordan smiled. There she is. Screw off. He reached down to grab his pants from his ankles, but to her continued horror, he took them off entirely, along with his shoes. Only now did she realize his belt was missing. Dude, what? He replied innocently. We have to get across the water. I'm not getting my clothes wet. He has a point, she thought, but she still wasn't planning on joining him. To either side, the river curled around the trees in a way that gave them no certainty of its beginning or end. A waterfall might have dropped a few meters beyond their line of sight, and they would have been none the wiser. Have you seen any of the others? He asked, still eyeing the distance between their bank and the far side. Her mind jumped to Liz, the demented look on her face while she gutted the dead bodies. She lied. No. She sat on the bank, hoping Jordan would stop nakedly pacing and allow her a moment to relax. To her relief, he noticed her and joined. I wonder how Johnny's doing, he wondered aloud. Emma grinned. Johnny? Not Margot? Jordan deflected. Margot can handle her own. I don't know about Johnny. You didn't see him gut those guys in the forest? She recounted. He was like a machine. That's my worry, he elaborated. He doesn't get emotional. He's too goal-oriented to maneuver when things go wrong. That's not what I saw, Emma thought, though she kept it to herself. Jordan turned to her. Who's in your car? My what? Your car, he doubled. The car that came to pick you up before reaching the edge of the floor. Oh, Emma hesitated. She hadn't thought about each of them encountering something different. No, I had a cave. There was a big wall that popped up at the edge, and I ran into a cave. Jordan was staring blankly across the water. Who's in the car? She asked. Your mom? He grinned melancholically. Well, it certainly wasn't my dad, he huffed. Would have revealed the secret from the top. His eyes were sullen and watery, but Emma knew he wasn't about to cry. How? She found herself saying. How'd you know? Figured it was too good to be true, honestly, Jordan admitted. Had my suspicions from the start. Didn't ask enough about Johnny, that sort of thing. Final drop was when she... He paused, thinking for a second whether he should reveal his secret aloud. She didn't know something she should have. I'm sorry, Jordy, Emma resigned. He looked thoroughly shell-shocked. Riley had been enough of a surprise to warrant her anxious state. She couldn't imagine being reunited with someone who might actually be dead, just for the whole thing to be a ruse. It was Riley for me, she breathed. Yeah, no shit. He changed, though, she dismissed. I think he changed to Andrew for a moment, but by the time I shot the thing, it was my mom. Again, Jordan was staring blankly across the water. I strangled her, he whispered. His face was whiter than usual. Emma wanted to say sorry again, give him a hug as tight as she possibly could, but then she remembered he was naked and sat pensively beside him. A few minutes passed in silence. Well, he finally gathered, I suppose we should try to cross this thing. How deep is it? No idea, he admitted frustratedly. My powers are shit underwater. Anything in there? She cautioned. Only one way to find out, he shrugged. Just then another rustling came through the thickets. On the opposite side of the maze door from whence Jordan emerged came Johnny, covered in claw marks and scratches up his freckled arms, but otherwise unhurt. He was still carrying the rifle. Emmy was happy to see him smiling as he walked into the open, probably at the bizarre scene of his brother naked beside her, but his smile dropped as fast as he had arrived, and he lifted the gun, not at Emma, but behind her toward Jordan. "John, it's me!" she heard Jordan shout over his shoulder, but as she spun around, she could see why the rifle was raised. Rising up from the water was a thick silver tentacle, several meters long, with long barbs like teeth armoring the entire underside. It grabbed hold of Jordan, who screamed as Johnny let loose a barrage of bullets at the creature, but they simply bounced off the hide as Jordan was dragged into the stilling water. Johnny continued to fire. Emma continued to scream, but there was nothing they could do. Finally, the gunfire stopped. "He's fine," Johnny accepted. "What?" Emma squealed. "What do you mean he's fine?" "I mean, this is a simulated environment," Johnny reasoned. "Think rationally. That thing isn't real. They just programmed it to separate him from us." Emma's mind raced to regather her senses. "The same thing happened with me and Margot," he explained. I was swallowed. It took me below the floor to an obstacle course." Emma blinked herself back. "Hold up," she exhumed. "Swallowed?" "Dinosaur," he said nonchalantly. "Big freaking dinosaur popped out of the floor like a gopher and dragged me underneath the floor." Emma was half horrified, half comedically bewildered, trying to imagine a theme park-style animatronic popping up at the end of the ride. "You're with Margot?" she found herself asking. "She found me," he explained, slinging the gun around his shoulder after the water fell back to its normal pace. "After the warehouse, she—" He paused, looking her up and down. Without warning, he grabbed her shoulder and spun her around, peering at the back of her head. "Oh, good," he relieved, spinning her back. Emma stared at him, frozen. "You have a freckle on the back of your ear," he explained. "Fake you didn't have it." "Fake me?" Emma relayed. Then the realization slapped her, and she could feel her face reddening. He saw me as his fake. The heat in her face was almost too much to handle. She felt lightheaded, but before she could think to sit down, he pushed. "We should get going." He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the doorway to the maze. "No, Johnny, wait," she started. "Liz was—" "I just saw her with Xander," he insisted. "They're fine. We're fine." He had squeezed her hand again, the same way he had done at the bowling alley to calm her, the same way he had done to put her to sleep. She took a deep breath and followed his lead. Johnny dropped the rifle back into his hands and crept cautiously around the first turn. Emma kept her knives ready. She was starting to get used to their weight. After just the second turn, the landscape had once again completely changed. The open courtyard was now replaced by a small set of high-rise buildings, making their walk into one through a series of tight, dark alleyways. The sound of dogs barking and distant car horns echoed around them. "Hold up," Johnny signaled. The space between their buildings was thinning, forcing them into a single file. They had reached an opening onto a larger street. Above them, rain began to fall in thick droplets. "What do you see?" she whispered. "Nothing," he relayed. "There's a single cop off to my left. I'm guessing we're supposed to avoid being seen." "What if he's friendly?" she wanted to joke, but the words stayed tucked in her throat. "I don't want to risk a shot," he said, so quietly Emma had to crawl up to his shoulder to hear. She blushed again. This was the closest they had been since last night. She could smell the usual pine deodorant underneath his arms. Her heartbeat was increasing, but not because she was scared, she realized. If anything, being with Johnny had made her calmer. "I need you to get him." He turned so she could hear. "You got knives, right?" "Yeah," she whispered. "Are we supposed to kill?" "At this point, I don't think it really matters," he said. "Either we get by him or we don't. We weren't given any orders." "All right," she agreed. They had to backtrack a few meters so Emma could slip in front. Despite the fact she would need to step into the open to get the throw off comfortably, they figured one body out in the open was less noticeable than two. The rain had turned to a downpour. She noticed the bright red and gold shop signs were written in Chinese rather than English. Lucky for them, it seemed to be very late. All the stores were either shuttered up or empty. She walked out very slowly onto the exposed pavement, sneaking closer and closer behind the helmeted cop who seemed to have no care in the world except continuing his cigarette. Cautious to avoid detection, Emma tiptoed to about 15 meters behind, then balanced the knife in her right hand, confirming the weight and balance. It was a trick she had painstakingly practiced thousands of times. Even in the rain, 15 meters was easy. She raised her hand to her ear and took one last measuring look at the man's back before letting the knife fly. It missed. The officer had not even moved, and yet the knife sailed a foot wide to the right of the man's head, bouncing off the pavement and attracting his attention. He spun around to find its source. Oh no, she thought. Quickly, Emma flipped the other knife from her left to her right and took aim again. He was moving fast, but he was still 10 meters away, shouting in Chinese, his gait slowed by the effort of removing an electric baton. Emma aimed the second knife and let it loose, and it missed again. She was too stunned to even defend herself. A jolt of electricity shot through her body so hard she couldn't feel its source. She fell to the concrete, shaking, struggling to breathe, as the man prodded her again and again. "Emma!" she heard Johnny shout. She was facing up now. Bullets flew over her head and struck the officer, who crumpled in a pile beside her. The rain fell over her face, but she couldn't make the effort to block them. She felt as though she was drowning. Johnny's footsteps rushed beside her. "Emma, what in the world was—" he started, reaching out a hand to help her until he saw her face. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. Even crying wasn't an option. "Oh gosh," she heard Johnny exhale above her. "Help! Xanders! Someone in the control room!" Emma still couldn't shift her eyes. Her whole body was shaking uncontrollably as the rain continued to pound her face. "What happened?" An unfamiliar voice bounced from her right. I don't know," Johnny tried to explain. The blurred outline of his face bent over hers. "I think she's having some kind of anxiety attack.